Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight, Latino Voices. I'm Joanna Hernandez. On the show tonight.
It has given us the opportunity to have real substantive conversations with migrants to help them move on.
Thousands of migrants left in limbo as the 60-day shelter limit approaches. Plus, renewed health concerns at a migrant shelter in Pilsen after a measles outbreak.
Little Village already has that strong entrepreneurial spirit, but they weren't getting the access to the same resources.
A community business hub is coming to Little Village. Get your solar shades ready. A total eclipse is on the horizon. Find out what you can see and where.
And there's no more iconic Chicago St. Patrick's Day tradition than dyeing the Chicago River green.
And a look at how and why Chicago dyes the river green for St. Patrick's Day. Back to kick things off right after this.
Chicago Tonight, Latino Voices, is made possible in part by the support of these donors.
It is unclear whether Chicago officials plan to evict thousands of migrants from city shelters as soon as Saturday. The 60-day shelter limit comes as health officials are scrambling to cope with an apparent measles outbreak in the city's largest shelter. Mayor Brandon Johnson defended the shelter limit policy on Wednesday, but says he didn't know how many migrants would be forced to leave city shelters. Let's listen.
What this policy has essentially done, it has given us the opportunity to have real substantive conversations with migrants to help them move on. I don't know if it's a substantial number, but again, they can return to the loading zone. That's one place, or they can decide to move on. You know, they don't necessarily have to remain within the structure that we're providing.
Reporter Heather Sharon joins us now with more. Heather, there's a lot to talk about here. As many as 5,600 migrants could be forced to leave city shelters in the upcoming weeks. Why is there so much uncertainty about their fate?
Well, when Mayor Brandon Johnson announced this policy back in November, he said it was because the city could no longer afford to cope with the toll of the crisis, both financial and otherwise. But he's issued 3 reprieves to this policy, once in January and again in February, leading to big questions about whether he actually intended to fulfill this policy. And we still don't know that answer today. Despite repeated questions from WTTW News and other news organizations, we don't know if the shelter eviction policy will be implemented this weekend and how many people it could affect, leaving a lot of these migrants, some struggling to sort of make their way in Chicago, in limbo.
I don't really understand what's next. Now, the deadline for some migrants to leave city shelters comes as the city is coping with the measles outbreak at a city shelter. What's the latest there? What can you tell us?
Well, the last update we got from Chicago health officials was that they had identified 8 cases of measles in the shelter in Pilsen, which of course has been the subject of repeated complaints about a lack of sanitary facility and a lack of isolation rooms for people who are ill. So it is not clear whether a health officials' attempts to get everybody vaccinated as quickly as possible will stop measles from spreading elsewhere in the city or to other shelters, leading many people to urge the mayor to put a hold on this policy at least until this crisis passes.
And talking about that, 22 city council members have asked Johnson to end his policy limiting migrants to no more than 60 days in city shelters. Will that force Johnson to reverse course?
Well, we asked the mayor about that yesterday at that press conference we saw just a clip of, and he really defended the policy as a way to sort of force migrants to sort of figure out what's next for them and to help the city sort of move them along in their journey. It's not clear what will happen, though, but it is clear that he is facing incredible pressure from members of the city council, including Alderman Andre Vasquez, who's the chair of the Immigrants' Rights Committee, who's usually an ally of the mayor, who does not want to see these vulnerable people forced to sort of seek shelter once again, perhaps at a different city shelter. I should also mention that there are somewhere in the neighborhood of hundreds of children who could have their sort of lives disrupted by this policy, while officials have said they will try not to disrupt their school year. It's not clear what steps have been taken.
Well, thank you, Heather, for that update.
Thanks, Jonna.
And you can read Heather's full story on our website. It's all at WTTW.com/news. Up next, we hear from community groups working with migrants ahead of the eviction deadline. As we just heard, thousands of migrants remain in limbo as mutual aid groups and older people urge Mayor Brandon Johnson to cancel the 60-day migrant shelter stay limit. The evictions have been postponed 3 times due to extreme weather. Now, with the measles outbreak at the city's Pilsen shelter, response teams say evicting people would only create a bigger problem. Here to tell us more are Emilio Arujo, Director of Development and Communications for Onward House, Alderman Byron Cicho Lopez of the 25th Ward, and Mimi Guaracacho, a public health nurse and mutual aid volunteer. We also invited the city and the Chicago Department of Public Health. CDPH declined a request, and we didn't hear back from the mayor's office. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. Alderman, regarding the 60-day limit, when you consider the measles cases, public health concerns, the process of obtaining housing and work permits, should this still be happening?
And I said it today during the Public Safety Committee. It is impossible to apply this 60-day notice, and with the short notice coming in, when we're asking people to be 21 days doing shelter in place. I think that what we need to do is to start talking about housing policies for all Chicagoans. It's clear that here's an attempt to destabilize the city. That is very clear. What we need to be doing is taking the responsibility to act. I mean, we're parents. We do not want children in the streets. We had 20,000 CPS children unhoused. We are aware of those challenges.
And we see them now in the streets with their mothers. I mean, I've seen some of them even selling candy or water bottles with their moms.
Absolutely. So what we want to make sure is to demand of the President of the United States, who has the executive power, to make sure that they issue work permits immediately. That's something that they can do. We relocate or resettle 29,000 Ukrainian refugees, rightly so. If they're fleeing violence, we have a responsibility. That's what we're sanctuary city for all. Now, these, and I'll be clear here, these white supremacist groups that come to pitch communities against each other to tell us about austerity, the city of Chicago voted to ratify the sanctuary city. We treat everybody the same here. We respect human rights. So what we expect, and I think the next few days, again, I talked to the Dr. Iggy, I've talked to OEMC, DFSS, all public servants, just as we were on this weekend, making sure that everybody's vaccinated. I'm going to talk to the CEO of CPS on Tuesday, make sure that we have vaccination in every single of our schools. What we need to make sure is that we treat this as a public health crisis.
Is that something that they're going to do?
That is my expectation, because we got to treat this just as we did during the pandemic, as a public health matter. There is an attempt to criminalize the Latino community, the immigrant community. We heard it from the president. He mentioned one case to call us all illegal and also criminals. I'm going to have a message I want to do it publicly. There's no one single study in the country that indicates that there's a relationship between violence and immigration. Quite the contrary. $216 billion in the last 5 years, immigrants have brought to cities like Chicago. What we need to make sure is that we talk to President Biden and remind him that we as a community, we cannot be dehumanized with flawless arguments that continue to prey in communities like ours. What we need is investment in housing, and we need investment in public health protocols.
And thank you for that. Mimi, I want to go to you. What have you worked down the block from the Pilsen shelter. As someone who's been on the ground early on, what have you seen of the conditions? Would you say the outbreak, like the measles, were preventable?
That's a great question. So yes, we as mutual aid representatives and volunteers have been working at the shelters, but before that we also worked at the police station. So I just want to maybe take a step back and say that this has been a public health concern since day one. And as a public health professional, I, alongside with a lot of mutual aid volunteers, have actually mentioned this to different, people in charge and officials, saying that this is a public health concern. It's not like this began now when we moved to shelters, or now that we've seen measles, or even, a sad death in a child. It began from when we were staying in police station floors, right? And so I just want to say that this whole situation could, is a result of kind of piecemeal solutions, which I understand in an emergency situation is necessary, but we're about a year and a half or more into this now, and we need to move away from just emergently responding and actually being proactive and preventative in our work.
Emilia, what are your thoughts? You also have Onward has a welcoming center. What are people experiencing when they're trying to get help or understand what's going to happen next after the 60-day limit?
Thank you for having me on the show. So I think it's really important to recognize that new immigrants arriving to Chicago didn't go up through this traumatic dangerous journey just because they want to stay in the shelters, right? They want to work, they want to pay taxes, they want to frequent local businesses, they want to be integrated into the fabric of Chicago. And so by providing resources like the healthcare services, like food, like the further down, when people get those basic needs met and are able to go to an adult education class or have education available to their children, all of that allows them to have that self-sufficiency that will continue to make our city stronger. So Onward House is really focused on making sure that new immigrants get to build that foundation so that they can be successful and make our city better.
What would you say that you've seen some of the challenges that are, or barriers that are happening?
Definitely work permits and asylum permits are very challenging. We've seen it could be as long as a 2-year wait for someone who's paying to, like, the cost of a work permit is $410, right? And if you're not able to work, how are you supposed to afford that? How can you wait for years in moving in and out of shelters if they're now going to be removed from those shelters if you have all of these challenges in your way?
So you would say this could create a bigger crisis. Alderman, we heard Mayor Brandon Johnson say there could be exceptions to the limits. What is your response to that?
Well, I think that we have to help all Chicagoans. I think that we need a housing justice agenda. I do think that there are many people in the city of Chicago who worry about evictions, that worry about, having shelter. Again, there's over 80,000 people that are unhoused. What we need to do, and while we have 80,000 units that are empty, what we need to do is to make sure that we tax those vacancies, usually by hedge fund managers that prey on people from our communities. We have displacement in our communities happening at the same time as we have a public health crisis. So we need to be proactive. We know how to resettle people in our city. 29,000 Ukrainian refugees receive work permits as they enter, jumping everybody's line, and it's okay because we know their emergency. Now when we have people with the exact same immigration status.
And I've heard you compare this before. You brought it up before, yes.
Absolutely, because it's a fact. These have the exact same immigration status. What is different is the skin color. That's what I call it out publicly. And I think that the resettlement process has to be followed by the state. The state did the same thing for current refugees. We have almost the same number of people right now that need the same help. And furthermore, we need to pass, for instance, proactive housing justice legislation like just cause for eviction. We need to amplify it and make sure that the federal government creates public housing. Or black residents are rightly so to be upset. In the West Side, 15,000 homeowners were left in the dark. Why? Not because of us. Why? Because those insurance companies and those corporations that want to take over those homes. We understand what's happening here, and we're not going to fall for the same old small. What we want is a housing justice plan. We're going to hold our agencies accountable, CDPH, OEMC, CHA. We got to create housing.
And I want to bring Mimi into this. Mimi, what are your thoughts? You attended and spoke on a march last week supporting the new arrivals. What would you say are the roadblocks at this point? What would you like to say?
Yeah, well, I just want to say that with, the upcoming eviction deadline, we're calling on the city of Chicago to stop these evictions alongside, the 22 aldermen and other community organizations, because that first eviction isn't where it ends. And I want to make that very clear. When we are telling people that they have to move out and they don't have those work permits yet, then we're going to just set them up for failure. Meaning the ACE wrap, which is already limited, and we can talk about that too, but that began as an emergent response to give people 6 months of, rent. Now that's 3 months. It's a lot harder to get into that program. And so we're giving them 3 months now with no work permit to somehow then go and actually survive. So what they're going to face is a second private eviction from those landlords, and they're going to end up on the streets unhoused. And so that's the thing, is we cannot just say push it. And the mayor said something about, they can decide to move on. Well, what are they moving on to? They're moving on to being unhoused in 3 months when they can no longer afford that rent. And so that's something that's very important to us that we're calling on is, for further investment in ACE wrap and other wraparound services for these folks. Because unfortunately, what they're doing, because I will tell you from seeing what you're all seeing probably around the city of Chicago, people are selling things for money because the conditions that they live in their shelters they're just not. They don't want to live there. As my colleague here mentioned and alluded to, they don't want to stay in those shelters. So they're looking for ways out. Unfortunately, what that means is sometimes they end up with jobs that, sadly, whenever they do find a job, they experience frequent wage theft, exploitation. And so we're putting them in dangerous conditions and leaving them up to fail. And unfortunately become part of the unhoused population of Chicago we're trying to overcome.
Mimi, we'll have to leave it at that. That's all the time we have, but thank you all for joining us on this topic.
Thank you.
Thank you so
and
much.
We're back with more right after this. Have you ever watched a solar eclipse? I haven't, but if you haven't, you are in luck. We're officially less than a month away from the next total solar eclipse. And reporter Patty Wetley joins us with all the details. Patty, this is going to be really cool. For those who are unfamiliar, what exactly is a total solar eclipse?
It is when the moon comes between the Earth and the sun. I need a third hand to show
Should we
you.
do a third here?
Yeah, and it looks as if the moon is completely blocking out the sun. Total eclipse, everything goes dark. It's very cool.
So when will the eclipse take place, and how much of it will it be seen in Chicago? I need all the details.
Yes, so April 8th is, mark that on your calendar. It'll start just before like 1 p.m. Chicago time, reach its peak in Chicago around 2 o'clock. We're only in for 94% partial eclipse in Chicago. You want to head down to the southern Illinois or Indianapolis or my hometown in Toledo if you want to be in the path of totality, which is where the moon will completely block the sun. It will go dark. It will look like it's nighttime. The temperature is going to drop. Animals could become confused. Is it day or night? So that's what the totality means. We're not going to get totality in Chicago. Close, but not quite. And
will Chicagoans be able to see it?
You will be able to see a partial eclipse, 94% partial eclipse. But the folks I've talked to are like, partial is great, but you really want to get the full experience. So if you can get to southern Illinois or scoot over to Indianapolis,
do it.
Do it.
And it's only been 7 years since the last total eclipse happened in 2017. Why should we not take this year's total eclipse for granted?
Because that was kind of a freak situation to have them come across North America so close. A lot of times they happen across the Pacific Ocean or Antarctica or the Arctic Circle. So for it to be across North America is really rare. It's actually going to be even more of an increased partial eclipse in Chicago than it was the last time. But cloud cover, anything can happen. So if you think you've seen one once or you think this opportunity is going to come around again, no, we're not going to see another one across North America until 2044.
Wow.
Chicago will not be in the path of totality until 2099.
Wow, okay.
So if you have a baby right now, by the time they're really old and retired,
and
they'll get to see it in
this
Chicago.
eclipse is taking place in daytime.
Yes, solar eclipse, daytime, not a lunar eclipse.
So what do people need who want to view it to protect their eyes?
I
know you brought some props.
Here.
Let's check them out.
You're going to need some eclipse glasses like this or a filter. These were from the 2017 eclipse. You're going to probably can't even zoom in on this, but they need to have this ISO certification number on them.
Can you check them out?
My web article links to the approved suppliers or the suppliers that are legitimate. NASA does not put its stamp of approval on anything. This Association of Astronomers has checked out all the legit suppliers. We have links to that. Don't necessarily trust the cheapest thing you see on Amazon. Day of, Adler Planetarium will start handing these out at about 11 a.m. for their show on the lakefront. So get there and get some.
Well, thank you, Patty. Thank you, Patty, for all that information.
Thanks.
Super cool. I'm going to try to make it. Now, you can read Patty's full story on our website. It's all at WTTW.com/news. Up next, we explain how and why the Chicago River will turn green this weekend.
Coverage of science and technology on Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Joel M. Friedman, president of the Alvin H. Baum Family Fund.
St. Patrick's Day is this weekend, and Chicago will celebrate with not one but two big parades. The official city parade downtown is on Saturday, and the Southside Irish Parade at 103rd and Western on Sunday. But Chicago is perhaps best known for what happens before the parade on the Chicago River. Here's Eunice Alpasan with the latest edition of our series, WTTW News Explains.
St. Patrick's Day in Chicago. While for some the holiday may mean green beer and lots of partying, one thing's for certain, Chicago's estimated 200,000 residents of Irish heritage take their traditions seriously. And there's no more iconic Chicago St. Patrick's Day tradition than dyeing the Chicago River green. The history of the Green River flows back to the local plumbers union. they've been sponsoring the dye job for more than 60 years. The story goes, as the plumbers tell it, that business manager Stephen Bailey got the idea from seeing a plumber in stained green coveralls. See, the city was working to enforce restrictions on waste going into the river during construction projects, and so plumbers were using dye to help trace the flow of wastewater and detect leaks. Bailey and his pal, Mayor Richard J. Daley, initially considered dyeing Lake Michigan before ultimately picking a portion of the more manageably sized Chicago River. And so, in 1962, the river got its first festive dye job. Bailey waxed poetic, telling reporters the dye would connect the city to Ireland, flowing from the Chicago to the Illinois River, onto the Mississippi, up the Gulf Stream, and across the Atlantic into the Irish Sea. The city has tried a few dye distribution methods over the years, but today a couple of motorboats do the job, turning a roughly quarter-mile stretch of the river downtown just the right shade, using what organizers say is an orange vegetable-based powder that turns green on contact with the water. The exact dye recipe has always been a closely guarded secret. Some local environmental groups have pushed back against the tradition, like Friends of the Chicago River, who feel it harkens back to a bygone era when the river was treated as a quasi-sewer rather than a living body home to fish and wildlife. But regardless of one's stance, there's no denying the tradition's influence. Other U.S. cities have taken the idea, dyeing their own rivers and canals each March. And with thousands gathering along the Chicago River every year to see it all unfold, the tradition doesn't seem ready to die anytime soon.
How cool was that? The Chicago River gets its 2024 dye job this Saturday morning at 10 between Orleans and Columbus. And you can see more from our Emmy Award-winning series, WTTW News Explains, on our website at WTTW.com/explains. Now, Little Village is known for its business corridor and Latino entrepreneurship. Now, a space coming to the heart of the neighborhood aims to give more resources to those hoping to kickstart a business of their own. On the corner of 26th Street and Drake Avenue stands an empty 3-story building.
We took a building that was built in 1880, and instead of tearing it down, we've decided to reinvest in the building and revitalize this building and save it.
Kim Close is the executive director of the Foundation of Little Village, the team rehabbing this building into a community hub.
It's on a corner, which is why it's called a skina, but it's really about investing in the resources that already exist here and bringing a new life to them. And that's why we're working with local operators.
The space is said to be a skina incubator and cafe. Close says they'll be home to La Catedral Cafe and Food Hero, a Latino-led culinary school, but also a space for entrepreneurs to explore their ideas.
The idea is to create an entrepreneurial ecosystem that brings together resources, programmings, local partnerships to help everybody grow.
Little Village has a long history of entrepreneurship. Close says the co-working space will give people more opportunities to elevate their businesses and work together.
This has been created in partnership with the business community to see what they want and what they need in this space, which is why we have the commercial kitchen, because between 80 and 90% of the entrepreneurs that are working in Little Village, they're interested in food businesses, like I want to bring a salsa to market, and that's why we included a commercial kitchen in Little Village, to meet the needs.
In partnership with the Little Village Chamber of Commerce, the city and private groups funded the project. The hub will also include a multimedia room, an artist gallery, and an event space.
Long-term, it's a project based in corridor revitalization, cultural preservation, and community wealth building.
The project is set to be completed by the summer when the community can access the cafe and communal kitchen. And that's tonight, 30 and 7 for the week. Now, from all of us here at Chicago Tonight, Latino Voices, I'm Joanna Hernandez. Stay healthy, stay safe. Buenas noches.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that is proud to recognize its 18 attorneys selected for the 2024 Super Lawyers List. PBS NewsHour, next on WTTW.
On Masterpiece Mystery.
He's finished it. Magpie Murders.
It's very Agatha Christie.
Atticus Pond, the world's greatest detective.
It's missing the last chapter. I'm going to go to Suffolk and look for the missing pages. Everyone he knew was in it. That's why the last chapter was taken, because it reveals the secret. The answer's in the book.
Magpie Murders on